Well, for more on this and other top stories of the week, we're joined now by David Shoebridge from the New South Wales Greens and Federal Liberal MP Jason Falinski. Good morning to you both. I'm stumbling a little bit here, but hopefully we'll manage to get through the week in news. And of course, we will take a look at that particular issue in regard to Australia's intake of Syrian refugees, and particularly pertinent given we had those conversations happening also between John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov around a possible ceasefire in Syria. But bringing it back home, David, I'll start with you. Australia, quite critical at the moment in terms of the pace that we're progressing with our intake.
Well, it was a good promise 12 months ago to bring 12,000 Syrian refugees in. The overwhelming burden for dealing with the millions and millions of Syrian refugees has been on developing countries. They don't have anything like the resources that we did. So we had a good announcement 12 months ago to bring 12,000 Syrian refugees into Australia, but it's looking like an extremely hollow promise. Only about a quarter of the refugees have actually been brought in. Only about half have been processed, and it's now 12 months later. We have a fundamental obligation to do our bit as a global citizen. People are in enormous distress, and in many ways, people fleeing from the terrible violence created by ISIS and the like. They are people who, when they come to Australia, will be just fabulous citizens. They will want to contribute to our stable democracy. They will reject that kind of violence, and we should be doing our bit to bring them to our shores.
Jason Falinski, Canada can take 30,000 in less time than Australia, the US 10,000. Why can't we meet our target?
Yeah, look, Adrian, the fact of the matter is that Australia is an incredibly generous country when it comes to refugees. As the son of a migrant whose father was effectively a refugee, my heart goes out to people in the middle of a civil war. It's just extraordinary. On top of that, our very generous refugee intake, we added another 12,000 spaces, particularly aimed at people who are in vulnerable situations in Syria, in particularly minorities that are being persecuted there. The important thing for the long-term and medium-term success of our refugee program is that its integrity is maintained. I wish that everyone was here right now, but the fact of the matter is we need to make sure that people go through security and character checks so that we get it right. There are 3,500 people who've been resettled, over 6,500 people have been granted visas, and hopefully we can get people here as quickly as possible, consistent with the integrity of the program.
So is there a failing, though, on the part of our process, given that we are lagging, it appears, lagging behind other countries like Canada?
Look, it's an incredibly complex environment, as you can imagine. It's the middle of a civil war. We're involved with a whole bunch of agencies in making sure that this program is rolled out as quickly as possible. I think it's important that we get it right, because if we get it wrong, it disturbs our entire, the integrity of the entire program.
But Jason, all the agencies that you're talking about that we're working with are criticising Australia for its incredibly slow action. Whether
David,
it's the
that's
UN,
just not true. David, who is saying that?
Whether it's World Vision, the people on the ground are saying that Australia has been dragging the chain, and they point to Canada. Canada has enormous integrity in its intake system. It's processed almost 10 times as many refugees in the same time as Australia. You're not telling us that Canada, we can't even do what Canada has done and actually effectively process the security checks. Canada has done 10 times as many processed refugees as Australia has. We should be looking to them for the basic competence and also for that humanitarian response. And I think it's a lack of political will on behalf of the Abbott and now the Turnbull government to turn that promise into reality. A generous promise, great, but we want generosity on the ground. We need to bring them here.
I'm not going to let anyone criticise Australia's refugee program. It's one of the best in the world. It's the most generous in the world.
It's not
the
your
criticisms
job.
The criticisms that you
criticism.
are making are just broad-based. You can't tell us who, other than amorphous
the United
people.
Nations,
Well, who in the United
UN
Nations,
Refugee
David?
Agency,
The point
World
is,
Vision,
David,
Caritas. These are the people
the point is,
criticising
we
Australia.
have Are you telling us we don't have one of the most generous refugee programs in the world?
I'm telling
Are
you
you
that
telling
a
me
generous
that the
promise.
Australian community is not one
Refugees
of the
don't want a
generous
generous promise, they
communities
want
in
a
the world
generous response,
when it
and we
comes,
haven't had
and
that.
that's what they're getting.
All right, well, I think it might be time to move on, shall we? Thank you for exploring that particular issue.
We can look at a different kind of generosity now, can't we? How's that
Yes,
for a segue?
perhaps you can
Break up the
determine
Grange
that.
for the next one.
Of course,
I was
we
about
are
to say, wait
referring
until we get to political
to the
donations.
issue of political donations. In the spotlight, of course, recently has been the former Labor frontbencher Sam Dastyari. He's since had to resign from the front bench, given his connections to Chinese business people and comments he's made in regard to Chinese policy. Do we have the right process in place that people aren't observing, or do we need to change the process here?
Well, our political donations laws is like Swiss cheese. It's riddled with holes. When a corporation can drop $12,000 to the federal MPs and not even have to tell anyone about it, when you can have corporations literally paying off MPs' debts and simply have it put in as a gift register. We've got a political donation system that is actually designed for cashed up corporate interests. And I think people know that. They get this sense. And they cannot believe that a frontbench MP is going around to business people and asking them to pay off their debts. I think people are right to be appalled by this. We need some committed action to actually reduce the amount of money going into politics. And I'm worried that part of this debate is about finding different ways of getting the same amount of money into politics. Federal politics, state politics, local politics would be a lot better if there was a lot less money rushing around in it, and if politicians, instead of having to go out for donations, corporate or otherwise, were actually going out and talking to people about the issues that affect them.
Jason Falinski, let me ask you, the PM has indicated he's willing to look at changes to the laws as well. So let's jump a step forward. If we have a system where these sorts of donations are banned, who will fund election campaigns and who decides which candidates get how much?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Adrian. And as the Prime Minister has pointed out, this is a very difficult and complex situation. This is not new, this problem. The Prime Minister's been talking about political donations reform for 20 years. And these decisions, and the New South Wales government had an investigation into this, headed by Anne Twomey, who's the head of constitutional law at the University of Sydney. I think the New South Wales government expected that Professor Twomey would advocate that there be a blanket ban on political donations and we move to public funding. In fact, she came back and said that people being allowed to make contributions to political parties is important. What Malcolm Turnbull's been advocating, what I would advocate, is that only people who are enrolled to vote in Australia as individuals should be allowed to make donations to political parties. That, more than anything else, will get the sort of taint of corruption out of the system. It will make it transparent. It will, more importantly, make it holistic. At the moment, New South Wales has a set of rules. The federal government has a set of rules. All the states and territories have different rules, and this patchwork isn't helping at all.
But even if we go down that path and people talk about maybe caps of 5,000 or 12,000 for individual contributions, how are parties going to raise the kind of money that they need come election time with caps of 5,000 on individual donations?
Well, Adrian, that's a great question. But the point is that federal MPs, all MPs, should be talking to their communities and getting out and talking to their communities, so they're not relying on money to help them win elections. That's the critical thing that's required here. That's why dragging money out of the system is so important, whether it's from unions or from overseas companies.
But I think most people, when they look at election campaigns, they get put off by the amount of negative TV ads. They get put off by the amount of electioneering, paid electioneering that they see. Why do we accept that there should be that amount of negative communication happening? I mean, Jason and I probably agree on this, that less money going into political parties, less money going into election campaigns would be a darn good thing for Australian democracy. And rather than setting caps at 5,000 or 12,000, we're actually seeing productive discussions about setting caps at $1,000 or $500. The New South Wales Greens have had a long-term campaign to try and cap donations at $1,000. But donations capped at $500, that democratises our political system, because, you know, it's a struggle for people on an ordinary wage to pull together $500, but they could. And instead of having it at $12,000, where it's going to be a cashed up minority that are going to really be able to influence, if we reduce all donations down to a maximum of $500 or $1,000, it's greatly democratised.
All right, but let's keep our eyes on the prize here and talk about money, this time in regards to issues around foreign ownership. We did have information come out this week looking actually at where the foreign ownership can be, the pie is sliced in Australia. And in fact, it's the UK and then the US. Yes. Chinese foreign ownership, which has been obviously a big issue for a lot of people and a lot of debate around that recently, particularly given the government's decision over the Kidman cattle property. Chinese foreign investment is actually quite a small slice of the pie.
Yeah, look, we made a promise at the last election that we would release data on who owned Australia's agricultural land. And surprise, surprise, 86% of it, just over 86% of it, is owned by Australians. Of the 13.6% that is owned by foreigners, overwhelming majority is owned by British and American interests. We have to remember, though, that foreign investment has been an overwhelming net positive for Australia and for Australians, and it's a two-way street now. There are $2 trillion, that's trillion with a T, of funds under management in our superannuation funds. They're investing a lot of that money offshore. As we saw in New South Wales in the poles and wires debate, the ETU's superannuation funds invested in privatised water in London, privatised electricity assets in China. So it's a two-way street. But what this data gives us the opportunity to do is to monitor where the investment's going and make sure that the rules that we have in terms of foreign investment continue to benefit Australians and our community.
David Shoebridge, what do you make of these figures?
Well, 13.6% is a big chunk of our farmland. But of course, it's not just a raw figure like that. I mean, a lot of that is large cattle leases, cattle property, which is relatively low productive. I think the real concern should be not so much foreign corporations, but foreign government-owned investment agencies targeting some of our most productive farmland, our most productive wheat production, our most productive dairy production facilities. And I do think that the Australian government has an obligation to ensure that we're not seeing foreign government-controlled entities picking off our most productive farmland. Because roll forward over the next century, the ability to produce food, high quality, cheap food, is going to be increasingly valuable. And clearly foreign governments are recognising that, and they're trying to target our most productive farmland in their acquisitions. Now, Jason says that's all for the good. Foreign investment is all for the good. Well, there is some good in foreign investment. It does create some jobs, does create some economic activity, but we also have a national interest here that I think we need to look at. And so it's not just about raw numbers in terms of hectares, and it's really not just about raw numbers in terms of foreign investors. It's when the investment is controlled by a foreign government.
You have something to say there, I think, in those points, Jason.
I mean, you know, we present a set of facts. Those facts aren't good enough. Actually, there's, you know, it's the numbers within the numbers that we still don't know. I mean,
it's
you know,
complexity,
I just
It's
wonder
the
when
world.
the Greens will be satisfied with a piece of factual information. Yeah. But foreign investment isn't just about economic outcome. Foreign investment has done more to lift people out of poverty, has done more to reduce conflict in the world, has made the world a better place. Foreign investment is critical in terms of non-economic factors as well, and that's why it's something that should be encouraged both here and around the world.
We could argue that. We could put,
we
could talk to foreign investment in the Middle East.
The Greens used to believe in the international brotherhood of mankind.
Listen to you. We could talk to foreign investment in the Middle East and see how wonderful that's been for world peace if we wanted.
All right, we've only got 1 minute left, guys. So we've only got 1 minute.
I love the jump from Australian farmland to Middle East. But anyway,
well, I'm going to take you to another part of the planet now,
yes.
and some figures out saying that there's been a catastrophic loss of 10% of the wilderness across the world over the past 2 decades. Alarming?
Now, more than alarming. I mean, it's catastrophic. And there are some key figures we should be looking at, some key facts we need to look at. And the fact is we have an irreplaceable asset here, which is the world's wilderness. And we should be making a global collective commitment to lose no more of it. Because wilderness is about much more than just the individual species that are in there. These are ecosystems that once they're destroyed can never be replaced. They service so many other parts of our natural system. We need a global response to this, and it should be not one more square inch is lost.
Very quickly.
Absolutely. Australia is a role model in preservation of environmental assets. We've been recognised by that globally. We're currently in Hawaii at the ICUN trying to get more preservation and more control over preserved areas around the world. 30% of this loss, most of this loss occurred in South America, where 30% of forests had been deforested over the last 20 years.
All right, Jason Falinski and David Shoebridge, thanks so much for coming in and chatting about the week that was.
That was great. We should do it again.
A very
We'll do it
good
again.
chat indeed. Thank you both.
Thanks, guys.